For the past few years, the AFC North was in large part a three-team division. It was about the Cincinnati Bengals, Baltimore Ravens, Pittsburgh Steelers, and in some particular configuration and order. And then, of course, you had the Cleveland Browns. Now that I look at it heading into 2016, it may somewhat feel like that to some people, although I don't know if it's that way. But I will say there are three other teams, and then there are the Cleveland Browns. So let's talk about how I think this AFC North could potentially shake out and play out in 2016. I'll start with the aforementioned Cleveland skid marks. Now, in the defense of this organization, I thought the hiring of Hugh Jackson as head coach was a solid hire, somebody that's familiar with the AFC North and his time as the offensive coordinator in Cincinnati, a good, bright, innovative offensive mind for an organization that needs somebody to shake things up a little bit. He's somebody I think that should be better for Cleveland. And in the 2 years he's going to be there as their head coach, he'll probably do some solid things with what little he has to work with. I will say that their offensive line is still pretty solid, even letting Mitchell Schwartz walk in free agency. And you still got Joe Thomas manning the blind side. He's as good as any left tackle in the league. Joel Bitonio is a pretty solid left guard. If they get something out of last year's first-round pick, Cameron Irving, this can still be a pretty solid offensive line, even with the loss of Alex Mack, even with the loss of Mitchell Schwartz. I think it still could be an offensive line that could be able to protect RG3, and they're going to need that offensive line to protect RG3. That's where the positives can end with this team. I'm just being honest. They got so many questions all over the place. Just overall, a lack of talent on this roster is striking when you look at it. You see a lot of youth there, and you see what you think could be a lot of potential, but just because you have a bunch of young players, that doesn't mean it's necessarily a good thing, because if they're young and they can't play, at the end of the day, they still can't play. And 3 years from now, they're still not going to be able to play. They have a lot of youth, a lot of inexperience. When you look at their starters with 3 or less years of NFL experience, you've got 6 of them on the defensive side of the ball, 4 of them, I believe, on the offensive side of the ball. This is a very, very young team, which can potentially be good. It could be a blank slate, a clean canvas for Hugh Jackson and that coaching staff to work with. But at the end of the day, there's just an overall dearth and lack of talent on this roster. And I still really question the philosophy of not taking Carson Wentz number 2 overall. Maybe Hugh Jackson thinks he can revitalize RG3's career, and maybe to a certain degree he can. But are you really going to pin your hopes on RG3 long term? And furthermore, when you look at this organization, the biggest problem I have with what they did in the draft, what they've done in free agency, with the bringing in of Hugh Jackson, like I said, that I thought was a solid move. I just don't see an identity. I don't see who they're trying to be or what they want to become. Like, you look at the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Baltimore Ravens and the Cincinnati Bengals in this division, they all have an identity of some type. And all of those identities are somewhat built on the defensive side of the ball, although Pittsburgh's less so in recent years with Big Ben and Antonio Brown, Le'Veon Bell. But you see the identity of each of those 3 teams. Now, part of that ties into they're more solid at the quarterback position than Cleveland, obviously, but that's not all of it. But I just have some real concerns about this Cleveland team. And I look at their schedule, and I'm like, where are they going to win games? I think it's a 3 or 4 win team. I'm fascinated to see that week 1 matchup in Philadelphia, though. It's the Cleveland Browns coming into town to take on the guy they maybe should have taken number 2 overall in Carson Wentz and the Philadelphia Eagles. That's one of the week 1 matchups I'm honestly looking most forward to. But for this team, I think week 2 is really important because they've got a home game against Baltimore. If they don't win in week 1, coming into week 2, this will be a nice way to, make a little bit of a statement in that division, beat a Baltimore team that they should have beaten once last year if it wasn't for that kick 6 to end the game, because only the Cleveland Browns could lose a game like that. And you look a little later in the year, weeks 11 and 12 and 14, you've got a stretch of 3 straight home games. They host Pittsburgh, host the Giants, host Cincinnati. If you're the Browns and you maybe did win 5 or 6 games this year and maybe you won 2 games in the division, you have to feel that's progress, and you have to feel that's a good first step to becoming a relevant, competent, competitive organization again. I just don't know if they're going to take those steps this year. That's not necessarily going to be a bad reflection upon Hugh Jackson. It's just this is not a good football team, let's face it. The Baltimore Ravens. I talked about it last year heading into the season. I thought they were an old team heading in the wrong direction. They're trying to get a little younger. I don't know if they got young enough. Sometimes that transition could take a little bit of time. I wasn't a fan of them letting Osemele go in free agency, but it is what it is. That's what they've done. But that's where part of the problem sometimes comes in for this Baltimore Ravens organization. Over the years, they've drafted people, let so many people go, and then the ones that they draft to replace them aren't as good as the ones that they left go. So while people praise Ozzie Newsome and that front office, and understandably so to a degree, in recent years, the performance just hasn't been that good by comparison in the past couple of years, I should say anyways. And, you look at this team and you just sit there and go, is this really a team that's going to be much different than they were last year? A mediocre football team that can be competitive in a lot of games. Now to be fair to the Ravens, they lost a number of close games last year, so if some of them go their way, maybe we're talking about an entirely different team. But sometimes you lose those close games because you're just not good enough. Now, I think they've got a good foundation in terms of running backs on this roster. I think they've got some talent there. Last year's fourth-round pick, Buck Allen, and then you're talking about their fourth-round pick this year, Kenneth Dixon. You've got Terrence West, a former third-round pick of the Browns, and then you've got Justin Forsett, who they released and they brought back. They've got some talent at running back. Then I look at their defense. You've got Suggs and Doomerville on the outside. You've got some depth behind them and guys like Zadarius Smith. In general, I still like their linebacking core. It's a linebacker-driven defense. If Suggs doesn't come back healthy or Doomerville takes a step back, I don't feel as good about them. But for at least this year, their linebacking core should still be pretty solid and effective. They've got stability at the quarterback position in Joe Flacco. You know what you're going to get. But a lot of other questions. You look at the wide receiver position. You got Steve Smith coming off of a torn Achilles. What is Mike Wallace going to bring to the table? What is last year's first-round pick Breshad Perryman going to bring to the table? Their defensive line is young, but is their defensive line good? I guess we're going to find out. And this is still an old team. They've got 10 starters that are 30 and older and a couple more that are 28, 29. This is not a young football team. And when you're an old football team and you're not a championship contending team, it tends not to go well for you. And that's what I'm really concerned about with this Ravens team, is that they're still in that period of transition, and I don't think this year is going to be a whole lot better for them than last year was. When you look at their schedule, you've got a couple of stretches I'm looking at here towards the second half of the season, weeks 9 through 12. They've got 3 or 4 at home. Those 3 home games are all divisional games, Pittsburgh, Cleveland. Week 11, they go to Dallas. They host Cincinnati. They really need to make some hay there. If they're going to prove me wrong and do something this year, they got to make some hay at that stretch, because the last stretch of the season, last 4 weeks, could be pretty brutal. They go to New England, who they do traditionally match up well against, but it's still a Patriots, still a quality championship caliber team. Host Philadelphia, then they go on the road to Pittsburgh and to Cincinnati. So if anything, that closing stretch of the season places an even greater emphasis on that middle portion of the season, where they've got those 3 out of 4 home games, and all 3 of those home games are against division opponents. They must make some hay there, and they must do well there, because if they don't, they'll be lucky to win 6 games. I think they're a 7-9 football team. I don't look at the Ravens right now and view them as a playoff team. I think there are 2 potential playoff teams in this division, the Cincinnati Bengals and the Pittsburgh Steelers. I look at the Bengals. This is still a solid football team. With quite a bit of continuity and experience, and they're balanced. They can win games with their defense. They can win games with their offense. They can win games running the football. They can win games through the air, believe it or not, sometimes with Andy Dalton. They can win games stopping the run. This is a good, solid football team. Well, that's the problem. For several years now, they've been a good, solid football team. And while that continuity and experience and balance is nice, what has it really meant at the end of the day? On top of that, you've got some questions, especially early on in the year. Who's going to be the number 2 wide receiver opposite A.J. Green? When they get Tyler Eifert back, is he going to be able to stay healthy? Is he going to be productive? I have some concerns about the back end of that defense. I have also some concerns about the mentality and maturity and focus of this team. Are they going to be able to overcome that disastrous performance last year in the playoffs against the Steelers? Are they going to be of the right mindset? Is that going to be the moment, 5 straight years of making the playoffs, 5 straight playoff losses, where this team implodes? Or is this going to be the ultimate point where they really galvanize and come together and they finally take that next step under Marvin Lewis? Because this has to be the year. It's either shit or get off the pot with this team and its current construction and its current leadership. It has to be. I think they're good enough still to make the playoffs. This is a solid team. All the knocks we want to make on the Bengals and all the things we want to shit on them about, this is still a really solid football team. And you could see where if this breaks or that breaks or this goes in their favor, this could be a team that could sneak up on you and potentially be an AFC championship contender. They can be. And they might be this year. But that's the thing. It's always about might be or the possibility and the potential. It's not the reality of who they are. At this moment, I think the favorites to win the division are probably the Pittsburgh Steelers. They've got the best quarterback in the league. They've got the best wide receiver or not in the league. They've got the best quarterback in the division. They may have the best wide receiver in the league. When they have Le'Veon Bell, they have the best running back in the division at least. So you look at that set of three amigos and Big Ben and Antonio Brown and Le'Veon Bell. That's a big three that you can win a championship with. They need to get better on defense. I have some concerns offensively about their offensive line, but I think they've got some decent depth on the offensive side of the ball. This is a team that, worst case scenario, can win games, scoring a lot of points, putting the ball in the air. They can be competitive in theory with just about anybody. What could hold them back defensively is that secondary. They're still not very good. I know they've addressed it some in the draft. They traded for Justin Gilbert because they needed to take a flyer on a gamble on a guy that was a former top 10 pick. But it's still not a good secondary. If they improve and progress and get better as the year goes along, and this is a team that could really scare some people because this is a team that, like I mentioned, in theory can beat everybody and anybody at any time. Unfortunately, sometimes what the Pittsburgh Steelers are bugaboo in recent years is that they can also lose to anybody and lose at any time. And we'll see how this plays out. For them, in terms of their schedule, I look at the last 7 games is really going to tell you everything about whether this team wants to be a major contender or not. They go to Cleveland, go to Indianapolis, host the Giants, go to Buffalo, go to Cincinnati, host Baltimore and Cleveland. So you look at it, the last 7 games of the year, they've got 4 of those are divisional opponents. And you can sit there and laugh about the Cleveland Browns, but the Cleveland Browns are exactly the type of team that when the Pittsburgh Steelers aren't careful, they're the type of team, like in years past, crappy Jets teams and Raiders teams have beaten them, the crappy Buccaneers have beaten them. These are the type of crappy teams that sneak up and beat the Steelers every single year, and I wouldn't be surprised if that happened once this year, and that would be a major feather in the cap for Hugh Jackson in year number 1 of the Cleveland Browns. With all that being said, though, I think right now at this moment in time, in terms of the regular season, the Pittsburgh Steelers are the best position to win this division and potentially make a deep playoff run. I do think it's either now or never for the Cincinnati Bengals. I want to give them the benefit of the doubt and say it's now, but it more likely than not is probably never. But I do think they're a playoff team. I think Baltimore maybe got just a little bit closer, but not nearly close enough. And the Cleveland Browns are still the skid marks of the National Football League.